Hey, this is Mr. P here. In this video, we're going to talk not only about species, communities, and ecosystems, but we're going to talk about ecosystem dynamics, as well as feeding relationships, and ultimately how nutrients cycle both through autotrophs and heterotrophs, and then how those two interact to kind of cycle nutrients through our environment. So, what does it mean to be an ecosystem, or a population, or a community, or a species? We have to kind of understand these levels of complexity. In previous videos, we've talked through atoms, we've talked through molecules, we've talked through cellular biology, we've talked through, in some capacity, how those cells interact to form tissues and organs. Later on in the course, we'll get into a lot of the body systems and how organs can interact to form a body system, but for the purposes of ecology and the purposes of this video, we're going to start at this base unit, which is called organism. And organisms that are all the same type of organism belong to the same species, okay? And the definition of species is a group of organisms that are so closely related that they can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. And the fertile offspring, as we'll talk about later in this video, is one of the most important considerations when you're talking about members of the same species belonging to that species. But as I will kind of discuss later on, that has some, or brings into consideration, some gray area as well. So, when you put members of the same species together in the same place, it becomes a population. And so, by definition, a population is a group of organisms of the same species living in the same area at the same time. Again, the same species can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So our example here, if organism level is a single elephant, then a group of elephants will make up a population. The population doesn't take into consideration any other species. It doesn't take into consideration any other plant organisms. It is simply a group of elephants, in this case, in the same place at the same time. If we bring in other species or other groups of organisms, then we get into a community. And so a community, by definition, is a group of populations living and interacting with each other in the same area. Again, it's a group of populations. A population is a single group of the same species, and so if we have a group of elephants, and a group of giraffes, and a group of wildebeests, and a group of lions, all living in the same place at the same time, then it is considered a community. The community does not take into consideration any of the abiotic factors, okay? Abiotic factors meaning non-living components. Those come into consideration when we start talking about the ecosystem. And so ecosystem, by definition, is a community and its abiotic environment. And for the first time in this entire level of complexity, this is the first time in which organisms / groups of organisms start to interact and utilize their abiotic environment. What does abiotic environment mean, or what are abiotic factors? Abiotic factors are things that are non-living that still have some real, tangible, life-altering capabilities. And what do I mean by that? Things like temperature is an abiotic factor that has substantial implications when we're talking about sustainability of life. So temperature, humidity, precipitation, water concentration, humidity, salinity, pH, all of those things are non-living, abiotic factors, but still interact with and create a dependency of organisms on those things. So, habitat, one little side note, we need to know what that word means, the physical environment or location in which an organism lives. That is really important. And so when we put all of these levels of complexity together, atoms come together in definite proportions to make molecules. Molecules come together to make cells. Cells form tissues. Tissues form organs. Organs come together to perform a body system, a specific function within the body. Body systems produce an organism, which makes our base model or base level of species, a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. When you put multiple of those individuals of the same species in the same place at the same time, you get a population. Populations coming together in the same place at the same time produce a community. Communities coming together in the same place at the same time and interact with the abiotic environment like the water, like light, like humidity, like temperature will form the ecosystem. And when you put the ecosystems together, it creates biomes. which are the larger areas that all come together to produce the biosphere. So, we've talked a little bit about what a species is. Let's talk a little more in depth about what a species is. We've already determined that by definition, a species is a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. The key word is "and," in my opinion, because not only can they interbreed, but they can also produce fertile offspring. Fertile offspring is one of the most important considerations when we think about the prolonged sustainability of a species, only because organisms need to be able to reproduce successfully in order to sustain their species long term. The species is, as I said in that previous slide, the basic unit of classifying organisms. You cannot go any further or any lower in that complexity than a species without going subspecies, which means suborganism. Members of the same species have similar physiological and morphological characteristics. That means they look the same. Okay, they have similar body structure. They have similar markings. They have similar mannerisms. All of those things can be observed and can be measured. They have the ability to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. They are genetically distant from other forms of species, meaning that a cow is genetically distant from a pig, and they're genetically distant from a cow, and they're genetically distant from dogs. But members of the same species, like all of these dogs, are more related or more distant, more recently related than they are with all the other organisms. And they have a common phylogeny or a common family tree. Those can actually be mapped. We'll talk about that more when we get into genetics. Okay, so why is there a challenge, or what are the challenges to our current definition of species? We've already said that the definition of species is a group of organisms that can reproduce successfully and produce fertile offspring. Well, there are some challenges that I'm going to pose and that are constantly posed both from biologists but as well as kind of human race, and that is members of different but similar species sometimes mate and succeed in producing hybrid offspring. Whether you know it or not, hybrids have been produced. Hybrids are, by definition, mixtures or kind of combo organisms that were made from very related species, but they are made from members of completely different species. They usually do not possess the same number of chromosomes, meaning the species that successfully mated don't have the same number of chromosomes as each other, and so that's what leads to offspring infertility. Hybrids, when they're made, are made infertile, and that is because the kind of the independent assortment and the segregation of the chromosomes that happen during the gamete formation as well as the conception phase do not line up successfully and often lead to offspring infertility. That doesn't impact the life and the potential production of the hybrid, and so the hybrids are born, but they are not born fertile, and so therefore cannot reproduce successfully themselves. What about two populations that could potentially interbreed, but do not because they are living in different niches or separated by long distance? We call that reproductive isolation. We've talked about that in the past when we went through evolution. We know that geological or geographical things like rivers and canyons and oceans and lakes can reproductively isolate different populations of organisms. And so even if they have the potential and capability of interbreeding, sometimes they don't because they're separated by long distance and therefore cannot actually meet up with members of their same species. And so even though they can, they don't, which kind of throws a little wrench in this definition of species. How should we classify populations that do not interbreed because they reproduce asexually? There are a lot of organisms, both prokaryotes and eukaryotes, that reproduce asexually, and so if they are not reproducing in the same capacity that are other organisms, are they considered a species? Even though they have different reproductive protocols and different reproductive processes, I think they are. But that's up for kind of debate. So what about infertile individuals? Now we're kind of going into humans. Sometimes humans can be infertile as well. Are they members of the human species or not? Our current definition of species says very eloquently that in order to be a member of a species, you have to be able to reproduce and successfully produce fertile offspring. And so if an individual has the is incapable of producing gametes, does that kind of exclude them from becoming members of a species? Again, I don't think it does. We get into ethics. But does the fact that a couple cannot having a child exclude them from the species? Again, that is up for you to decide. I think not. What about the technique of in vitro fertilization? In vitro fertilization is a process of actually reproducing kind of externally. It takes sperm cells and egg cells from a couple that is incapable of reproducing successfully on their own and kind of takes on a more laboratory approach in order to successfully combine sperm cells with egg cells. Okay? All of these are challenges to our current definition of species. I don't know that the current definition of species is very good, but it is what we have at the moment. Again, the definition is the ability to interbreed and produce fertile offspring is, by definition, or our current definition of species. So we talked a little bit about hybrids. What are they? If members of two closely related species interbreed successfully, the resulting offspring will be sterile/infertile, meaning they do not produce viable gametes and therefore cannot reproduce themselves successfully. These all three are actual hybrids. They look very similar to organisms that are obviously on the planet because these are literally animals. But the first hybrid up is a zorse. A zorse is a hybrid, but is produced specifically from a female horse and a male zebra. The next one probably looks the most common. It's a mule. These are produced all the time. It is a female horse or a cross between a female horse and a male donkey. They have capabilities of, pack animals like donkeys do, but they also have the larger size and more robust morphology like a horse. And then you have the liger. It's a female tiger and a male lion. There also is a tyan, which I believe is the opposite. So if you have a female lion with a male tiger, I believe they call it a tyan. It looks a little different based on some morphology, but again, it is a hybrid. All of these animals are hybrids. They are produced by members of different species. The members of different species are close enough related that they can produce offspring, but they do not produce offspring that are fertile, and so therefore cannot be classified as members of the same species. What does it mean to be reproductively isolated? This is an example of two species of fish that were once really closely related. In fact, they are both members of the porkfish genera or genus. However, they have a different species name. Okay, same genus, different species name. So that tells you it's very closely related. They look different, even though they have some common morphology traits in common. But what happened was, over time, reproductive isolation led to speciation, meaning formation of a new species, and there was once a time where this Isthmus of Panama kind of rose and completely closed this land bridge, so to speak. And so therefore, members of these species got reproductively isolated. What would eventually become this fish got stuck on this side, kind of the east side of this strait, and members that eventually became this fish got stuck on this side, and because they no longer had the ability to reproduce with each other, even though they could, because they were once members of the same species, they were not. They are reproductively isolated, and because of different environmental conditions, have been evolving separately ever since it was closed. Okay, and so now they look a little different, they behave differently, and they are completely members of different species. And so if we went in and we actually opened up a channel and allowed these fish to actually kind of mingle with each other, they might be able to reproduce successfully with each other, but they wouldn't because they have evolved separately for so long that they don't even recognize each other as members of the same species anymore. That's what it means to be reproductively or geographically isolated. So what is an autotroph? Autotrophs are producers. Producers are members of or are organisms that will utilize photosynthesis or chemosynthesis in order to produce their own food. Plants are photosynthesizers. There are certain bacteria that are chemosynthesizers. Chemosynthesizers are going to be things that do not utilize sunlight. Those are organisms that typically live like in hydrothermic vents at the bottom of the ocean. But in both cases, they belong to the producer level. That makes them autotrophs. They make up the base of the food chain that they are kind of belong to. Heterotrophs are your consumers. We as a human are obviously heterotrophs. We cannot produce our own food. We consume other organisms for energy. Examples of these heterotrophs, as we'll see in future slides, are herbivores and carnivores and omnivores and stuff like that. But all of the organisms that make up the class, kind of the big classes, like fish, mammals, reptiles, birds, all would be heterotrophs. They cannot photosynthesize and therefore have to consume other organisms for their energy and inorganic matter. So, what are the types of heterotrophs that need to be discussed in an ecological context? These are all heterotrophs. They all are considered consumers. They all have to consume other organisms for food and ultimately energy. And so what is an organism that produces its energy by eating only meat? Those would be your carnivores. If an organism only eats plants, it's considered a herbivore. If they eat both plants and animals, they are considered an omnivore. Typically, humans are in this category. Now, there are humans that only eat plants. Those would be obviously considered vegetarians. Those are more along the lines of herbivores. However, our physiological and morphological traits and our tooth structure are that of omnivorous creatures. We have another heterotroph called a scavenger. These are consumers that only consume dead or previously deceased organisms. Things like vultures and hyenas would be scavengers. We have detritivores. Detritivores we often don't think of as consumers only because they are kind of absorbing the organic and inorganic matter from soil. Those would be things like earthworms. And then you have fungus, the decomposers. These are saprotrophs. We don't often, again, think of mushrooms as consumers because they're not actively like acquiring prey, but they are growing on decaying organic matter, and they're considered a consumer because they secrete digestive enzymes which are going to cause external digestion, and then they absorb the nutrients that are being decomposed and digested outside of their body. So again, it is a consumer. The two that we need to kind of talk about and specify are the detritivores versus the saprotrophs, because a lot of these are very similar in kind of their behavior. Obviously, one is motile, like the earthworms, and one is not. But detritivores, like these earthworms, obtain nutrients by consuming non-living organic sources, such as detritus and humus. Detritus and humus are basically kind of nutrient-rich, decaying plant and animal matter, which makes almost like compost a very nutrient-rich topsoil. These are things like earthworms, dung beetles, woodlice, crabs. All of those are going to be consuming inorganic and organic substances from soil. You also have the saprotrophs, which are your fungus and bacteria that are actively going to secrete digestive enzymes on the organic matter and absorb the products of the digestion. These are the things that are actively doing the decomposing. So saprotrophs, I want you to think about, are the decomposers. Okay? Detritivores are not decomposers, even though detritivores are typically found in areas where decomposition is happening. The saprotrophs are doing the decomposing actively. The detritivores are just eating the stuff that is being decomposed from or by the saprotrophs. What about organisms like a Venus flytrap or a euglena? These are organisms that can do both. So can an organism use two modes of nutrition? Meaning, can an organism both photosynthesize and consume? And the answer is yes. The euglena species is a genus of algae that will utilize photosynthesis if and when light is available, however, can also ingest and digest food particles by a process called phagocytosis, which is essentially cell eating. So they would take a food particle, they would ingest it basically by an infolding or an invagination of the cell membrane. It would cause the food particle to enter the internal structures of the single cell eukaryote, and they would therefore digest that food particle that way. but they also are green, they contain chlorophyll, they will photosynthesize for energy when light is available. Venus flytrap is a plant species that can totally photosynthesize. It will most of the time utilize the photosynthesis to produce its energy. However, because Venus flytraps come from or are really kind of concentrated to areas where nutrients are very poor and where living conditions are very kind of boggy and swampy and most of the time inhabitable, they compensate for that by ingesting insects for the inorganic nutrients and minerals that they are lacking and can't get from their environment. So yes, an organism can use two modes of nutrition, and they do that. These are two examples by which that happens. Okay. The last thing we need to talk about is how the nutrient cycles. So we've already talked about autotrophs, we've talked about heterotrophs. Now we kind of need to put it all together. So autotrophs, like plants, like this tree, are going to convert nutrients from inorganic form into organic form, meaning they're going to take inorganic carbon dioxide and water, and they're going to make glucose, which is an organic glucose molecule. It's a carbohydrate. And so once the carbohydrates are made by the plant, they are going to be consumed by the heterotrophs. That means the plant is the producer, the heterotroph is the consumer. Both plants and animals will eventually die. They will be decomposed by saprotrophs, and they will eventually be broken down into organic forms that will eventually be reuptaken by the plants and get cycled that way. And so nutrients are constantly being cycled. We will have future lectures where we talk specifically about specific nutrient cycles. We'll also have future videos about how energy flows. One thing that I often say in class is that nutrients cycle and energy flows. This is one instance in which nutrients cycle between the environment, heterotrophs, and autotrophs. Nutrients come from the environment into autotrophs, into heterotrophs, and then will be returned through decomposition back to the environment. Okay? That's where we're going to leave it. Hope you learned something. Bye.